Yesterday's announcement by Joe Biden that he was going to rescind the presidential permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. Over its 12-year lifetime, the pipeline project has sidestepped delays, protests, rejections, and lawsuits. But the on-again, off-again project, as I mentioned, is off again. Let's look at a little bit of a history of the project and what Alberta invested in it. Alberta has put a lot of eggs in the pipeline's basket. The Kenney government invested $1.5 billion in the project last year and committed $6 billion in loan guarantees for this year. The Canadian leg of the pipeline has been under construction for months, providing work to more than 1,000 people in Alberta. They're now out of a job, and this country won't see any of the $30 billion in projected revenue over 20 years. Let's get more reaction to this from the Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney. He's in Calgary. Hi, Premier Kenney. Good to see you. Thank you for making time for our program.
Good to be here.
Premier, do you regret sinking more than $1 billion into this project now that taxpayers have in effect lost their money?
Absolutely not. I think any responsible Alberta government would have done the same thing. We were elected in 2019 on a commitment to do everything possible to get pipelines built. Just like the federal government purchased TMX for over $7 billion, and the NDP government that preceded us, $3.7 billion to move a small amount of oil by rail for 3 years. We thought this was a necessary investment because otherwise the Keystone XL pipeline would have died last year. We've created thousands of jobs in the past year building this, creating the infrastructure, including the border crossing. You know, for us, this is a part of a broader strategic effort to overcome the effort to landlock Alberta energy. So we've been taking an all-of-the-above approach, and we believe that if this is a final decision, that we have a very strong case to obtain damages, compensation through legal challenges.
And I do want to ask you about that in a second, but on the concept of responsibility, this situation is not perfectly analogous to the one with TMX. TMX is within Canadian jurisdiction. This pipeline, as you mentioned, crosses a border, is dependent on U.S. jurisdiction to a certain degree, as we've seen evidenced over the last 24 hours. It's not like even with the presidential permit under President Trump, there weren't further hurdles in court as well. We knew President Biden had a chance of becoming president. Is it truly a responsible decision to sink at least $1.5 billion taxpayer dollars in it when we are where we are today?
Absolutely, not just responsible, but necessary, because without that investment, there would have been absolutely no progress, and this would have been a dead letter. The reality is both of those projects have faced a degree of political and legal risk, but that legal risk and that political risk has been created by a well-organized, a largely foreign-funded campaign to landlock Canadian energy. The same groups that have led to yesterday's rescinding of the presidential permit for a border crossing that already exists are trying to do the same thing and decommission all of the major pipelines that take $100 billion worth of Alberta energy to the United States every year in the largest element of Canada's global trade. You know, this project, if completed, we estimate would generate about $30 billion in incremental revenue for the government of Alberta alone, create nearly 60,000 jobs. This is a project that was supported by all of the major construction unions and private sector unions in the United States. First Nations were signing up for a potential equity partnership. Every state government along the corridor supported it. And the government of Canada told us that they supported this until they folded yesterday in a way that they did not fold when the Trump administration threatened to tear up NAFTA and impose steel tariffs on this country. So, Vashi, we cannot allow this precedent to stand without a meaningful response, because that invites further aggression from the same political forces in the United States against the largest element of Canadian trade with that country.
Respectfully, Premier, though, the response that you're asking for is sanctions. I mean, you're saying the federal government should levy sanctions, and like they did when it came to NAFTA. The entirety of the trade relationship between our two countries was under duress during the NAFTA negotiations, and they levied the sanctions first. Our sanctions were retaliatory in nature. How would increasing the cost of imports from the United States benefit the energy sector in this country?
Well, first of all, what we're calling on the federal government to do is what it pledged to us they would do, which is to seek to sit down with the Biden administration and to discuss Keystone XL in the broader context of a coordinated North American policy on energy and the environment, including climate policy. That was the commitment because, Vashi, as you know, the oil sands have reduced carbon intensity by 30%. Many of the producers have net zero commitments. Canada, under the Trudeau government, has more ambitious emissions targets than the Biden administration. And we are making huge investments in this province and technologies to continue reducing emissions. At the very least, we should demand of our closest friend and ally is the respect to sit down with us and talk about the largest, by far the largest element of our trade with Washington. So we're asking that that be step A, but if the Biden administration refuses to give this country sufficient respect to hear us out on this pipeline in that policy context, then yes, there absolutely must be reprisals. And this would be a reprisal. This would not be, it's the U.S. government that decided to retroactively repeal permits that for something, infrastructure that already exists. And Vashi, we need to understand how critical this is. The Southern Ontario economy is fueled by something called Line 5 that takes Alberta energy there, passes through Michigan. The governor of Michigan is trying to decommission that. President Biden's new environmental policy advisor wants to kill Line 3 that delivers enormous amounts of energy to the upper Midwest. If this precedent is allowed to stand, those organizations will seek to use the presidential permitting power against longstanding infrastructure that would be devastating to our economy. We need to stand up for ourselves.
And I'm certainly not disputing the effect that it's going to have on Albertans. I'm mindful of the people who lost their jobs. But in essence, you're saying you want the federal government to tout a climate plan, which you have opposed voraciously, and if not, to apply sanctions that would not be in equal retribution as the ones under NAFTA would be. They would have an effect on Canadian consumers, would they not?
Well, let me back up to your earlier comment about the tariffs. They weren't about NAFTA per se. They were specifically in response to U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum exports.
Retaliatory. Now,
that is about a $10 billion annual bilateral trade. Vashi, the energy trade is nearly $100 billion. It is 10 times larger. Alberta stood behind the thousands of Canadian steel and aluminum workers affected by Donald Trump's unfair tariffs, which he campaigned on, by the way. We supported reprisals. But why aren't energy workers worth the same degree of defense by our national government when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of energy workers, not merely thousands?
But this project isn't hundreds of thousands of workers. It's 1,000 people.
I'm sorry.
Pardon me, I apologize. I'm just saying this project itself, there are other energy projects at stake, right? TMX is one of them, for example. That has a direct line to the number of energy workers employed. This one project isn't the entire industry.
Well, what this decision by the new president yesterday was a direct attack on the vital economic interests of Canada, the retroactive changing of a U.S. regulatory decision, an investment in which a Canadian government is a participant, a slap in the face to this country in our largest export trade to the United States. And so to simply walk by this, as yesterday the ambassador said, we have to accept this and move forward. The Minister of Foreign Affairs said, quotes, "We understand and respect the decision." When Donald Trump campaigned on tearing up NAFTA and imposing steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada, our national government didn't say, we accept that and we move forward. They fought it. They were right to do so. They had the support of Alberta and energy workers in doing so. Why aren't those workers worth the same kind of defense that our steel industry got last year from the government of Canada?
But I take your point, but it's not. It's
a precedent that I believe will be applied, could be applied, and there will be a campaign to apply it to other major pipelines that are a critical part of the Canadian economy.
I take your point, Premier. It's just not a perfectly analogous situation. If the U.S. decided to slap tariffs on all Canadian oil, then yes, it would necessitate the same level of reaction that the federal government had with NAFTA. But this is one project, and the president has been pretty unequivocal, and he was months ago, even when you were investing Albertans' money in it.
Actually, we made this announcement in March, and Joe Biden had not spoken about this project until June, when his campaign announced.
He was vice president to the president when he killed the congressional.
Well, I've asked you to be clear. I think Joe Biden mentioned Keystone XL twice in the summer, responsive to questions at news conferences. Donald Trump campaigned every single day for 18 months on tearing up NAFTA and imposing steel and aluminum tariffs. We did, you don't accept election commitments from foreign governments if they attack your vital economic interests. You stand up for workers. You stand up for the Canadian economy as the national government. And this is, when you talk about proportionality, the completion of Keystone XL is worth $40 million a day to the Canadian economy, tens of billions of dollars of government revenue. And if this precedent stands without a meaningful response, there is no doubt that the governor of Michigan will seek a presidential permit to presidential decision to abrogate the permit on Line 5. That fuels the Southern Ontario economy. That the climate advisor to President Biden, who strongly opposes Line 3, will likely suggest a similar measure there. So this, let's be clear, by far the single largest element of the Canadian trade with the United States is our energy exports, nearly $100 billion a year. Imagine if this was something affecting Bombardier, or the Ontario auto sector, or the Atlantic Canadian fisheries sector. I don't think the federal government would surrender without even trying to put up a fight.
Okay, Premier, I'm out of time. I do appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Thanks, Vashi.
That's Alberta's Premier Jason Kenney. Some U.S. lawmakers, are expressing disappointment with the president's decision to rescind the Keystone Pipeline XL's presidential permit. Here's senior Republican Senator Chuck Grassley. Hi, Senator. Good to see you. Thank you very much for making time for the program.
Glad to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Senator, you tweeted this morning that you're surprised President Biden is killing the Keystone XL project without even negotiating with the Canadian government. Why are you surprised when President Biden was so explicit during the campaign he planned to rescind that permit?
Because of the friendship between the United States and Canada. It's a kick in the teeth to the best friend we have on this planet Earth. And it not only hurts the economy of Canada, but it hurts the economy of the United States. We have an opportunity to create so many jobs as a result of this. We have an opportunity to enhance the exports of one of the best products we have to export. It makes us more dependent on Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. And why would any president want to put us in a position of being more dependent upon those authoritarian countries? And I just think that the promises that President Biden made to labor unions create jobs, and his number one goal is to create more jobs. That's why we're going to have a stimulus package. Well, this Keystone pipeline would have been a major part of creating jobs in the United States, and Canada would benefit the same way. And so I just, regardless of what he said during the campaign, I would expect friendship between Canada and the United States, and for that matter, friendship between President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau to override that.
We had a former ambassador from the U.S. to Canada on yesterday who said if this, regardless of the differences around the position itself, if this was the position of the president, as he expressed during the campaign, better to rip the Band-Aid off now than prolong a decision he was ultimately going to make. What do you make of that argument?
What I would make of it is pretty simple, that the president had second thoughts about it. He didn't take into consideration the damage it would do to Canadian-American relations and the jobs that would be lost, and he just changed his mind.
The Canadian government has said that they accept the decision. The provincial government of Alberta, that's where most of the oil would be coming from, says that they want the federal government, if they can't get a discussion with the president about it, to impose sanctions on energy products from the United States. What do you think of that?
Well, in our country, you couldn't do that. If you can do it in Canada and they want to show their dislike of it, that's their decision to make. But I would hope that it's my understanding that Premier Trudeau and the president are going to talk tomorrow for the first time since our president is president instead of being president-elect, that they'd have a deep discussion about this, and there'd be a change of heart on the part of President Biden.
Is there any mechanism beyond that change of heart, for example, at the Senate's disposal or at Congress's more largely disposal to fight back against this decision, for example?
I don't think we would have the votes to do it if we wanted to. I think that there was. I think that there's a possibility that this could be fought in the courts of the United States, but not through the Congress.
And finally, the arguments that you posed just a few minutes ago about the economic benefits to the United States of the pipeline. It has been the argument of President Biden and before him, President Obama, that those benefits have been overstated. For example, obviously there would be jobs created during the construction, but as far as the permanent jobs go, the State Department analyzed there'd be less than 50 permanent jobs in the United States. Do you understand the position, I guess, of President Biden based on that?
Well, there's obviously going to be more jobs in construction, but whether it's a short-term job or a long-term job, it's still a job. And you're talking about individuals who are being hurt as a result of it. And one of the things about this whole decision is of the president, from my point of view, is not taking into consideration that the Canadian companies involved were committed to making sure that this was zero impact on greenhouse gases through the use of alternative energy, and that they were going to invest, I think, well over $1 billion into that effort through wind, solar, battery. And as a person who here in the United States government more than 30 years ago sponsored the wind energy tax credit, where now in my state of Iowa, we get 40% of our electricity from wind, and the president and his supporters and the environmentalists are very much in support of alternative energy. This gives a big boost to alternative energy, and the president's not taking advantage of it. And it seems to me environmentalists are talking out of both sides of their mouth. If the Canadian company promises zero impact on climate change, what's wrong with just going ahead with it?
Yeah, that's a promise they made just last Sunday, net zero emissions on the project. But certainly we'll look to see if that is something that comes up during the conversation tomorrow. Thank you, Senator. I appreciate your time very much.
Okay, goodbye.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.